There is a strange stillness to the places we build for the end of a life, a hush that doesn't quite belong to the living world. It hangs in the air like dust, suspended in a cathedral beam, soft and shimmering, yet too heavy to ignore. In that quiet, beneath the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of polished wood and flowers, something else lingers, something older, deeper, shaped by a force most people never think about until they have no choice. And as we step into that stillness tonight, welcome back to the story of money. The funeral industry is one of the few businesses built entirely around the certainty that one day every person becomes a customer. It is a marketplace no one wishes to enter, a transaction carried out while the world is blurred by grief, exhaustion, and the unreality of loss. And yet behind the velvet curtains and formal arrangements, a quieter, more deliberate story has been unfolding for more than a century. A story about how an industry born from family traditions and small-town artisans slowly transformed into something vast, consolidated, and astonishingly powerful. If you find yourself drawn into this journey, consider liking and subscribing. It helps keep stories like this alive, stories that trace the hidden pathways of money through the intimate corners of our lives. But tonight's story begins long before corporations, long before the term market share ever touched the business of mourning. It begins in small, dimly lit workshops where carpenters shaped pine boxes with the same hands that repaired fences, built barns, and carved cradles. In rural America of the 1800s, the funeral trade wasn't really a trade at all. It was a communal duty, a neighbor's kindness. Death was handled locally, practically, and without ceremony beyond what a family could provide themselves. There were no glossy brochures, no embalming packages, no industries, just people, humans, tending to humans. But when the Civil War erupted, it did something unexpected. It introduced America to distance in death. Thousands of soldiers died far from home, and grieving families wanted, desperately, to see their sons, brothers, and husbands one last time. A new technique, embalming, rose from relative obscurity to national necessity. Suddenly, the role of the local carpenter became more than woodworking. It became science, logistics, and preservation. A profession began to form, and with it came the first seeds of an industry. It became science, logistics, and preservation. A profession began to form, and with it came the first seeds of an industry. Across small towns, carpenters began advertising themselves not as cabinet makers, but as undertakers, a word that carried both solemnity and opportunity. These were people who saw a need, a gap in the fabric of society, and filled it with a service most people were grateful to accept. They brought structure to moments of chaos, they brought order to heartbreak, and they charged for it because they had to. Tools cost money, chemicals cost money, horses, carriages, preparation rooms, all of it had expenses attached. Funerals became business, but business that still lived close to the human heart. For decades, this world remained intimate. Most towns had one undertaker, sometimes two. Families knew them by name. You could walk into their workshops, smell fresh sawn wood, see the craftsman's hands worn by a lifetime of practical work. But as America grew, cities swelling, technology advancing, so too did the economics of death. By the early 1900s, funeral homes were no longer workshops but full-service establishments, places designed to ease grief through comfort, ceremony, and convenience. Parlors replaced front rooms, hearses replaced wagons, professional associations formed, establishing standards that elevated the work but also created gates around it. Funerals became more elaborate, more expensive, more essential to the rituals of saying goodbye. And yet, through all this change, there was still something profoundly local about the trade. Funeral directors lived in the same towns as their clients. They served the same families for generations. Many didn't think of themselves as business owners in the modern sense. They thought of themselves as caretakers of tradition, guardians of community trust, and that trust was immense. Because when a loved one dies, most of us don't compare prices. We don't negotiate. We don't shop around. We choose the place we've always known, the name our parents mentioned, the building we pass every day without ever really seeing. In economics, there is no environment more vulnerable or more powerful than the purchasing moment shaped entirely by grief. But this vulnerability didn't concern the independent funeral homes. They saw themselves as ethical stewards. The issue would arise much later when people outside the community, people who saw not grief, but opportunity, recognized just how unusual, how remarkably stable this market was. It wasn't just that everyone eventually needed a funeral, it was that funerals almost uniquely resisted economic downturns. They were recession-proof, predictable, necessary. And as the 20th century rolled forward, a different kind of mind began to take interest in this quiet, fragmented landscape of thousands of small, family-run businesses. Investors, they saw inefficiency where families saw tradition. They saw margin where undertakers saw service. They saw, above all, a market with no real competition and no real alternatives. Because even if there were choices available, most people in mourning were too overwhelmed to explore them. In the world of capital, such a market is irresistible. But before that wave of investment arrived, another transformation had to occur, one rooted not in economics but in culture. As the century progressed, death was pushed further from the home. Where families once prepared bodies themselves, now professionals handled every step. Hospitals grew, mortuary science advanced, and with these shifts, the funeral director's role expanded from caretaker to orchestrator of an entire experience. Caskets became products, services became packages, cemeteries aligned with funeral homes, creating seamless pathways from death to burial. Everything became smoother, simpler, more standardized, and more profitable. And in this streamlining, in this growing alignment between service and sale, the industry drifted toward a shape no one had intended but many would soon exploit. A structure that could be consolidated, centralized, scaled. Yet for now, in the early decades of the 20th century, that future remained hidden behind polished wooden doors and soft, reassuring voices. Funeral directors still saw their work as a calling. Families still brought casseroles to the homes of grieving neighbors. Communities still held each other together, not with contracts, but with kindness. But the economics were shifting beneath their feet, quietly, inevitably, like the slow tide reshaping a coastline long before anyone notices the erosion. And soon, this intimate world, this small-town, handshake-based business built on trust and tradition, would be discovered by forces far larger, far more calculating. Forces that understood something simple and unsettling. If you control the ritual of goodbye, you control one of the most unbreakable markets in the world. By the middle of the 20th century, the funeral home had become one of the most stable institutions in American life. The same way a church anchored a neighborhood or a post office marked the center of town, the funeral home became a constant, known presence. People passed it without really seeing it, yet trusted it without question. It was a place most hoped they would avoid for as long as possible, but when life demanded it, they entered its doors with the certainty that everything would be handled with dignity and care. But beneath that dignified stillness, the industry was quietly drifting toward a future its founders could never have imagined. The funeral homes themselves hadn't changed drastically, still often family-owned, still rooted in personal relationships, but the world around them had. Americans were becoming more mobile, less tied to hometowns, more fragmented across vast distances. Traditions were shifting. Families who once lived on the same street now lived in different states. And while communities changed shape, businesses were learning to grow in ways that once seemed impossible. Chain restaurants replaced diners, supermarkets replaced corner shops, department stores replaced tailors. America was embracing scale, big, efficient, predictable. And in the boardrooms where fortunes were made by consolidating the small into the enormous, someone eventually asked a simple, startling question: why not funerals? On paper, it made perfect sense. The funeral industry was fragmented, thousands of independent homes, each one carrying enormous fixed costs: preparation rooms, embalming equipment, fleets of hearses, large properties with viewing rooms and chapels, all for a business that couldn't scale naturally because death did not follow predictable volume surges. One week, 3 funerals, the next, none. Yet the lights stayed on, the building had to be maintained, staff had to be paid. To an investor, this wasn't just a business, it was an inefficiency waiting to be harvested. And so in the 1960s and 70s, the first wave of corporate acquisition began. Companies formed with a single mission: to buy funeral homes. They approached aging owners whose children didn't want the business, or whose buildings had become too expensive to maintain. They made offers that seemed generous, reassuring. The selling family could stay on as managers. The name on the sign wouldn't change. The community wouldn't know the difference. And that last promise was crucial because the new owners understood the psychology of their product better than anyone. The power of a funeral home was its identity, its history, the trust it had accumulated across generations. Change the name and you disrupt that trust. Keep the name, keep the facade, keep the tone, and you inherit the loyalty that came with it. Corporate consolidation slipped quietly, almost imperceptibly, into the fabric of American mourning. But the real turning point came with the rise of one company whose ambition dwarfed all others: Service Corporation International, known as SCI. Founded in 1962, it began as one funeral home in Houston, Texas. But its founder, Robert Waltrip, saw something very few people had ever considered: that death care could be scaled the same way as fast food franchises or retail chains. Waltrip didn't speak in the soft, measured language of funeral directors. He spoke the language of growth, capital, expansion. He believed funerals were not just community services, they were underleveraged assets. He looked at the fragmented industry and saw not thousands of small businesses, but thousands of acquisition targets that could deliver steady revenue, predictable margins, and inelastic demand. Inelastic demand, that was the phrase investors loved most. A product people had no choice but to purchase at the exact moment they were least capable of resisting price. In normal markets, consumers compare. They wait for sales, they choose alternatives, but no one stands over a casket catalogue calculating who offers the best deal. Death suspends ordinary economic behavior, and SCI built an empire on that suspension. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, SCI acquired funeral homes at an unprecedented pace. They bought the building, the equipment, the business records, the brand, and then kept almost everything exactly the same. Staff wore the same suits, greeted the same families, spoke in the same gentle tones. The only thing that changed, quietly, invisibly, was the ownership, and with that, the economics. Where families once paid modest sums to small-town operators, they now paid corporate rates set far away, determined not by community needs but by shareholder expectations. Still, most Americans had no idea, because the logo on the door did not say SCI, it said Williams & Sons, or Greenleaf Funeral Home, or any one of thousands of names that felt familiar, local, trustworthy. SCI understood something powerful: control the place, keep the name, preserve the illusion, and you inherit the loyalty without earning it. This strategy spread. Other corporations emerged, each racing to buy as many homes as possible before competitors did. Prices rose not due to scarcity but due to consolidation. When one company owned most funeral homes in a region, families had fewer choices, even if they didn't know it. And beneath the rising costs was something even more unsettling. Corporations began restructuring funeral homes to maximize profits in ways small operators never would. Caskets were marked up thousands of percent. Embalming became a default instead of optional. Service packages became labyrinths designed to push families toward higher tiers. Staff were trained not as caretakers, but as salespeople. Some were given scripts, gentle, professional, but unmistakably strategic, crafted to steer grieving families toward decisions that improved margins. Meanwhile, the small, independent homes that remained found themselves squeezed on all sides. Suppliers raised prices, competitors used corporate leverage to negotiate cheaper deals. Real estate costs soared, advertising budgets ballooned. And because funeral homes relied on reputation rather than marketing, many independents simply couldn't keep up. One by one they sold, and each time they sold, the buyer grew stronger. By the 1990s, funeral industry consolidation resembled a slow, quiet monopoly, one not obvious to the public, not enforced through branding, but built through invisibility. A monopoly hidden in plain sight, wearing the familiar face of community tradition. And yet, inside the boardrooms, the tone was very different from the calm voices in the viewing rooms. There, funerals were not sacred rituals. They were revenue streams, acquisition strategies, quarterly targets, a human necessity transformed into a financial instrument. The funeral home, once a local sanctuary of grief, had become something else entirely, a node in an expanding network designed not around mourning, but around scale. Still, consolidation alone did not create the modern monopoly. Something larger, something cultural, was happening too. A shift in the way people died, the way families organized, the way society understood ceremony and obligation. It would be this shift, gradual and unspoken, that would allow corporate funeral chains to tighten their grip even further. Because as America changed, death changed with it, and the industry was waiting, ready to capitalize. By the late 20th century, the funeral industry stood at the crossroads of two powerful forces, corporate consolidation on one side and cultural transformation on the other. America was aging, families were spreading out, religious traditions were loosening, medical systems were extending life, but also medicalizing death, shifting final moments from home to hospital, from familiar hands to sterile corridors. The funeral home, once a place where neighbors gathered in shared recognition of life's fragility, was becoming increasingly distant from the communities it served. And this distance had an economic consequence. When death no longer felt intimate, funerals no longer felt familiar. The rituals became abstract, offered not as inherited customs but as curated experiences. Funeral directors, now often employees of corporations rather than owners of a family legacy, were trained to fill the silence of uncertainty with guidance that frequently pointed toward more elaborate, more expensive arrangements. Families walking into funeral homes in the 1980s and 90s found themselves presented with options they didn't know were optional. Embalming, once a technique used sparingly, became framed as a standard necessity. Viewing ceremonies, once a cultural preference, became default. Caskets evolved from simple wooden boxes into glossy showpieces lined in silks and metals, priced in thousands. Burial vaults, once non-existent, became mandatory in many cemeteries under the guise of protecting the ground, even though they protected little beyond the profit margins of suppliers. And yet no one questioned these additions. How could they? In grief, the human mind softens, it becomes porous. The world narrows into a tunnel of memory, regret, longing, disbelief. This is not the mindset of a shopper, it is the mindset of a mourner. And in this state, economic rationality evaporates. Corporations understood this intimately. Training manuals instructed staff in a language calibrated to grief. Soft, measured, persistent. They learned how to guide families toward the best choice, a phrase that subtly blended emotional responsibility with financial generosity. They learned how to pause at the right moments, how to let silence deepen discomfort, how to allow the tension between love and guilt to push families toward more expensive decisions. Most families choose, "It might give you peace of mind. It's a beautiful tribute. This option really honors who they were." These statements were not coercion. They were gentle nudges, emotional cues that turned price lists into moral landscapes. If love demands sacrifice, then surely a higher-priced casket is an expression of devotion, not a product upsell. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, something else was happening. Something that transformed the economics of funerals forever. Suppliers consolidated too. Casket manufacturers, once scattered and regional, merged into a handful of national giants. Vault makers followed suit. Flower wholesalers, cremation equipment companies, embalming chemical producers all began to centralize, mirroring the very funeral homes they supplied. With fewer competitors, prices stabilized at higher levels. And because funeral homes had no choice but to buy from these suppliers, they passed the costs along to families. But corporate funeral chains went even further. They negotiated exclusive deals with suppliers in exchange for lower wholesale prices. Except the savings weren't passed on to families, they were pocketed as profit. The markup on a casket sometimes exceeded several thousand%. A $300 wholesale coffin might retail for $3,000 or more. This economic ecosystem, consolidated suppliers feeding consolidated service providers, created a loop in which prices rose without meaningful resistance. Yet families, sheltered from the realities of the market by grief and tradition, rarely noticed. At the same time, another cultural shift compounded the industry's strength: ownership of cemeteries. Historically, cemeteries were community institutions, churchyards, municipal grounds, non-profit associations managed by volunteers or local clergy. But as cities grew and real estate became more valuable, maintaining these spaces became burdensome. Corporations stepped in, offering to modernize, professionalize, and take care of everything. Once acquired, cemeteries became part of integrated death care networks. Funeral homes referred families to corporate-owned cemeteries, which in turn sold burial plots, vaults, gravestones, and maintenance fees. Every product connected to another in a seamless chain of revenue. If funeral homes were the front door to the industry, cemeteries were the long tail of profit that extended far beyond the day of burial. Plot sales, opening and closing fees, perpetual care funds, monument installation charges. All of these became standardized, monetized, and quietly increased year after year. But the most powerful leverage point came from something far more subtle: the psychology of obligation. In many cultures, funerals are not just ceremonies, they are displays of respect. To choose a lower-cost option feels like a betrayal, a failure to honor someone's memory. Corporate funeral chains learned to position their offerings along a moral spectrum. Simpler or cheaper options weren't framed as frugal, they were framed as insufficient, incomplete, lacking dignity. A family might walk in planning to spend a few $1,000s. They might leave having committed to $10,000. Not because they were manipulated overtly, but because they were guided gently toward the belief that anything less would diminish the person they loved. In this environment, even cremation, once considered the simpler, more affordable alternative, began to shift. As cremation rates rose in the 1990s and early 2000s, corporations recognized a threat. Cremation eliminated many high-margin products like embalming and expensive caskets. So they adapted. Cremation packages appeared, bundled with services, urn upgrades, memorial jewelry, and niche ceremonial additions. The simple became complex. The affordable became layered. And just as cremation became mainstream, corporations quietly consolidated that sector too. They purchased crematories, increasing control over the entire process. So even families who thought they were choosing a low-cost route often ended up back within the corporate ecosystem. By this point, the funeral industry had become a network of interlocking monopolies. Suppliers, service providers, cemeteries, crematories, all reinforcing each other. And while no single company controlled everything, a handful controlled enough to shape the market. But monopolies do not form solely from consolidation. They crystallize when alternatives shrink, when independents struggle, when consumers lack information, when grief suppresses choice. All four had taken root, and yet a new disruption was approaching, one that threatened the industry's carefully constructed empire. A shift not of economics but of culture. A movement that questioned not just the price of funerals, but their purpose entirely. A movement toward simplicity, transparency, and control. But the funeral industry, and especially its largest corporations, would not let go of their power quietly. Because when an industry discovers how to monetize sorrow, it clings to that discovery with relentless tenacity. By the early 21st century, a quiet rebellion had begun to stir against the machinery of the funeral industry. It did not start with protests or headlines. It started with whispers, families questioning costs, journalists uncovering hidden practices, small communities wondering why funerals had become more expensive than weddings. The questions spread slowly, carried on the breath of ordinary people who felt a quiet unease every time a bill arrived, padded with fees that made little sense. Cremation, once considered unconventional in the United States, surged in popularity. It offered something families hadn't felt in decades: simplicity, no viewing, no embalming, no ornate casket, just a direct, plain process. A return, at least partly, to an older, more straightforward way of accepting death. And with it came a realization: perhaps grief did not require grandeur, perhaps love did not require luxury, perhaps memory was not measured in mahogany and silk. For the first time, the funeral industry faced a threat it could not acquire or outmaneuver easily: cultural change. Families who chose direct cremation often bypassed the most profitable elements of the funeral home. And not only were they choosing less expensive services, they were choosing different providers altogether. Small cremation-only businesses emerged, offering clear pricing and simple, transparent packages. They had no chapels, no viewing rooms, no sprawling facilities to maintain, so their costs were low and their prices even lower. And for corporations accustomed to decades of predictable revenue, the shift was alarming. Funeral homes built on a model of high-margin casket sales could not easily pivot when those caskets stayed in storage. The industry responded with a combination of adaptation and resistance. And for corporations accustomed to decades of predictable revenue, the shift was alarming. Funeral homes built on a model of high-margin casket sales could not easily pivot when those caskets stayed in storage. The industry responded with a combination of adaptation and resistance. Other funeral homes engaged in subtler tactics, positioning cremation as cold, impersonal, disrespectful, the choice of someone unwilling to honor a loved one fully. Pamphlets and brochures shifted tone, hinting that direct cremation lacked the dignity a proper farewell required. The emotional cues that once nudged families toward ornate funerals were now repurposed to protect legacy profits. Yet the cultural tide continued to rise. People moved more frequently, families became more secular. The rituals that once anchored traditional funerals began to lose their grip. And with the internet, information, long the funeral industry's most powerful barrier, became accessible. Price transparency websites appeared, online memorial services grew. Articles circulated questioning why a simple box of wood or metal should cost more than a month's rent. The industry, once protected by silence, now found its long untouchable model under scrutiny. But corporate funeral giants, especially SCI, were not passive observers to their own unraveling. They fought back with a strategy as calculated as it was relentless. They continued acquiring funeral homes not to expand the old model, but to control the alternatives. Some of the cremation-only businesses were purchased quietly, and absorbed into the corporate network. Their branding remained the same, their websites unchanged, but behind the scenes, prices rose and profits flowed upward rather than staying local. At the same time, corporations leaned heavily into pre-need sales, funeral plans purchased years before death. These plans became financial instruments, a way to lock in future revenue long before families were grieving. Salespeople were trained to appeal not to sadness, but to fear. The fear of burdening children, of leaving chaos behind, of being unprepared for life's most certain event. Pre-planning expanded the industry's reach into living rooms, community centers, and retirement homes. It turned mortality into a subscription. Yet the most potent force in the industry's resurgence came not from sales, but from regulation. Local and state laws, often shaped by lobbying efforts from large funeral corporations and trade associations, reinforced barriers that small competitors could not cross. Requirements for expensive equipment, zoning restrictions for crematories, licensing requirements that demanded years of training, these rules were often framed as safety measures but conveniently aligned with corporate interests. A family wanting to start a simple cremation business might find themselves facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in mandated equipment. A community trying to open a green burial site might encounter zoning rules designed to be impossible to satisfy. Regulation did not eliminate competition outright, but it slowed it, burdened it, reshaped it into a form that benefited those who already held power. In the shadows of these maneuvers, another trend emerged: consolidation of obituary platforms. Newspapers, once the gatekeepers of death notices, shrank. Online obituary platforms rose, and many of them were quietly owned by the same corporations that owned funeral homes. The lines between communication, commerce, and ceremony blurred. A family posting an obituary might be gently prompted toward planning tools, memorial products, or partner services, all subtly integrated into the corporate ecosystem. Innovation did not bypass the industry, but the industry's grasp ensured innovation bent toward profit. Eco-friendly burials, a growing movement embracing simplicity and sustainability, were monetized into specialty packages. Digital memorials became subscription-based. Live-streamed funerals, rushed into mainstream use during the COVID-19 pandemic, remained premium offerings long after restrictions eased. The industry's evolution mirrored a truth that has shaped monopolies throughout history. When threatened, they adapt not to serve, but to survive. And beneath every adaptation was the same quiet calculation, the understanding that grief is not merely an emotion, but a moment of vulnerability. A moment when families, overwhelmed and uncertain, seek guidance from those who appear to know what must be done. The funeral industry did not merely provide that guidance, it shaped it. It sculpted expectations. It defined norms. It wrote, silently, the script of goodbye. By the time families realized the breadth of the industry's control over funeral homes, cemeteries, crematories, obituaries, and even memorial technology, the monopoly had woven itself into the very rituals of mourning. The rebellion against this system grew louder, but the industry's defenses grew stronger. Yet beneath this clash of culture and commerce lay something deeper, something that revealed why the funeral industry became a monopoly in the first place. It was not merely about money, it was about authority, tradition, trust. Monopolies do not rise only on the foundation of acquisition. They rise when an entire society forgets it has alternatives. And as the 21st century unfolded, a new set of questions emerged, questions that challenged not just the price of funerals, but the entire structure of how we say goodbye. Questions that would culminate in the quiet, impactful reckoning of what the funeral industry had become. In the stillness of the present day, if you look closely, you can see the cracks forming in the architecture of a monopoly that once seemed unbreakable. They are not loud cracks, not the kind that bring down walls in a dramatic collapse, but hairline fractures, subtle shifts that reveal something essential. the funeral industry's power has always depended on the assumption that people would not or could not imagine another way. For generations, the rituals of death were inherited without question. You did what your parents did and what their parents did before them. You walked into the funeral home you had passed on your way to school. You spoke with the director who had buried your grandparents. You accepted prices that felt immutable because this was not a moment for bargaining or doubt. The emotional gravity of loss created a gravitational pull toward whatever was familiar. And in that familiarity, the industry found its strength. But as the 21st century entered its second decade, something changed, not in boardrooms, not in legislation, but in the quiet spaces of ordinary lives. People began asking questions they had never asked before. Why is a casket more expensive than a used car? Why does a vault cost more than a month's salary? Why is simplicity treated as lesser when grief itself is already so heavy? The answers were not easy to find. Transparency was never the industry's strong suit. But in the age of the internet, silence became porous. Families shared stories. Journalists dug deeper. Consumer advocates uncovered pricing disparities that were impossible to justify. And alternative funeral movements, natural burials, home funerals, body composting began to spread, slowly but steadily, carving a path into a labyrinth that once had only one exit. At the heart of this change lies a realization as old as humanity. Death does not require spectacle to be meaningful. A body can return to the earth without chemicals. A family can gather without a chapel. A farewell can be whispered beneath open sky in a forest clearing or in the quiet intimacy of a home. These ideas are not new. They are ancient, older than the industry that grew around them, but rediscovering them required stepping outside the architecture of expectation that corporations spent decades constructing. Still, even as these alternative movements gained momentum, the funeral industry did not disappear. It adapted, incorporating the new into the old. Natural burial became a premium add-on. Eco-friendly caskets were marketed as luxury items. Cremation jewelry, biodegradable urns, and green-certified services became revenue streams. Innovation that began as rebellion was slowly folded back into the system it sought to challenge. This is the paradox at the center of the industry. Every attempt to escape it risks being absorbed by it. But monopolies do not endure forever. They shift with culture, with economics, with the slow turning of generations. Today, most Americans choose cremation over burial, a reversal the industry once feared but eventually embraced as a business opportunity. Direct cremation, the simplest and least expensive option, has risen sharply. Digital platforms allow families to plan funerals without entering a funeral home. Green burial sites are increasing, small but persistent in their growth. Home funerals, rare but deeply meaningful, are re-emerging in pockets of society searching for agency in a process long dominated by professionals. And in this shifting landscape, the true monopoly begins to weaken, not because corporations are shrinking, but because imagination is expanding. For the first time in more than a century, families are confronting the question the funeral industry least wants them to ask. What do we actually need? Do we need a $3,000 casket, or do we need a moment of peace? Do we need embalming, or do we need time to sit with our loss? Do we need an ornate ceremony, or do we need a way to remember, to release, to heal? These questions do not dismantle monopolies overnight, but they change the terrain on which monopolies stand. The funeral industry remains powerful. It still owns vast networks of funeral homes, cemeteries, and crematories. It still influences legislation, shapes norms, and sets prices in ways many families will never notice until the bill is in their hands. It is, in many places, still the default, an empire of gentle voices, polished rooms, and inherited expectations. But its authority is no longer unquestioned, its dominance is no longer invisible, its future is no longer guaranteed, because once people understand they have choices, real choices, meaningful choices, the foundation of any monopoly begins to erode. And yet the story of how the funeral industry became a monopoly is not just a story of corporations or money or laws. It is a story about us, about how societies face the pain of loss, how people seek comfort in rituals, how vulnerability can be shaped by those who understand its weight. The industry grew powerful because it offered certainty where uncertainty was unbearable. It offered structure where chaos was overwhelming. It offered tradition when people were too lost to build new ones. It stepped into a space carved by grief and filled it with services that for many felt essential. And that is why its monopoly took root so quietly, not through force, not through deception, but through trust. Trust, once given, is difficult to question, especially when questioning comes at the moment when we feel least capable of challenging anything. But trust can change, it can shift, and sometimes it can return to the places where it once flourished: small communities, shared hands, simple rituals, an understanding that death belongs not to an industry, but to families, to friends, to the human heart. In the end, the future of the funeral industry may not be one of domination or collapse, but of balance, a coexistence between tradition and innovation, between professional care and personal choice, between what we have inherited and what we are choosing to reclaim. Because the story of money, when traced far enough, often leads us back to the story of meaning. And meaning is not something any corporation, no matter how vast, can monopolize forever. For now, the industry stands, polished and steady, its doors open to a world still learning how to grieve differently. But outside those doors, new pathways are forming, quietly, gently, persistently. And perhaps that is how all monopolies end, not with a crash, but with a whisper, not through destruction, but through rediscovery, a rediscovery of choice, a rediscovery of simplicity, a rediscovery of the truth that grief, in its raw and unadorned form, needs far less than the industry has taught us to believe. And as we move forward, step by step, family by family, farewell by farewell, the monopoly that once shaped the way we say goodbye may finally begin to loosen its grip. Not because the industry has changed, but because we have.